Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me out here, and obrigado for having me out here. It's really great to be here in person. Last year, I did it virtually from my home office, where I had a green screen. It was very exciting, but this is way better. So I've been at Google for a long time, and in open source even longer. I look after. And you should take this with a grain of salt. I look after all the incoming and outgoing source code for Google and Alphabet. Now, if anyone tells you that, you should immediately not believe them, because we're an enormous company. Someone's always doing something that we're not tracking. And so we just try to be the best group possible looking after software at the firm. So let's go ahead and go to the first slide here. So this does work. Okay. So future speakers, this is what you're looking for, and I won't steal it. So here's the thing. If you look at the growth of open source software, free software, the internet, and open standards, it's really a virtuous circle, right? Back in the early days of the web, there was a lot of excitement. Everyone wanted to try it out. Everyone wanted to pop up a server, have people read their information from all over the world, right? And I remember at the time, people were like, "Oh, this is so exciting! We'll download NCSA Mosaic. We'll, start throwing bits down the wire. It'll be so great, right?" And then companies were like, "Hey, we should do this too. Hey, Oracle, Microsoft Sun, whatever at the time. Hey, can you give us this software for serving?" And they're like, "Well, we can, but we don't really know how to sell it to you. So." Maybe we'll sell you client access licenses. So anyone who accesses the web, they can have an access license, and that'll work out great. And they're like, at this point, it had been months of discussion. They had already downloaded early versions of HTTPD and then Apache, and they were already serving. So then you had the open standards open standards communities, folks inside the W3C, folks like the What Working Group, who were like, listen, we should be deciding what HTML is and codifying that, and then open source browsers, open source servers would be right there. And so they were playing off of each other really efficiently. And for the most part, commercial entities, they sort of got their feet under them, and they started competing as well within all of these markets. So it was actually this sort of perfect situation where you had proprietary, open source, free software, all sort of trying to be the best possible world for their users. This isn't about being against commercial licensing. Google ships a ton of proprietary software. But if you look at how open source works, what it's good for, how everyone bases their software on it, you're really... You forget this virtuous circle at your peril. So let's keep going. So this is the thing I know you all wanted from this discussion is, what is a software license? What is copyright? You're like, so if you didn't get a nap earlier, maybe now's your chance. The former presenter mentioned that if you were going to fall asleep, they were going to come up to you and talk to you. That's not who I am. I'm fine. If you need a nap, maybe you're jet lagged, maybe you drank too much last night, whatever, take a nap. I don't care. But here's the thing. This is actually really important, right? You can't really understand open source, or frankly, proprietary software licensing, until you understand software licenses. So every software license is like this, okay? It's just a collection of rights, what you can do with that software, with that source code, and then it's a collection of obligations and warranties, meaning what you have to do to be able to use the software in that manner, in the blue. So without the red, you don't get the blue. Without the blue, you don't care about the red. So this is the MIT license, one of my favorite permissive licenses. And it says you can, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sub-license, and/or sell copies of the software, and permit persons to whom the software is furnished to do so as well, subject to the following condition, the red part. And in the case of the MIT, it's you have to preserve the copyright notice. You have to acknowledge me, right? Acknowledge that you're using the software, which is kind of great. But here's the thing. Everyone forgets what happens after that, and it's really, really important, right? So all this capital letters stuff up here, the stuff screaming at you in internet, is basically saying, listen, I'm giving this to you. You can do what you want with it, but you can't expect me to protect you. You can't come to me and find me liable if you screw up with my software, right? This warranty clause is really important in the United States, especially if you don't have it and you get sued for fitness of purpose or for merchantability or for these other things, you will lose, and people have lost in the courts, right? So you don't have this warranty, you're not shipping software because you don't need the exposure, right? And this is why licenses like the WTFPL, while entertaining, aren't really suitable for use by open source people because we know how to protect ourselves. So the thing about these warranty clauses, and the reason I bring it up here is really important. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So there is legitimate, laudable, and important concerns about the software that's being provided under the moniker of artificial intelligence. And there's very real concerns that people are going to be creating software that will introduce bias, that will do things like say that these people over here are a credit risk when their only problem is they're in the wrong zip code or they have the wrong color of skin or religion. And so what they want to do is they want to have this act that companies can't use the ideas of artificial intelligence to introduce racism and classism where they've been trying to fight it for so many years. This is a good goal. This is laudable. Unfortunately, deep within the AI Act is something called provider liability. And so you're saying, well, wait a second. Why isn't it okay if a European government should pay a software company for a solution that solution isn't one of these problematic solutions? And you're right. That is an important goal. The problem is if you read the Act, it says that also the providers of software underpinning these software solutions should also be held liable, meaning literally the open source software libraries that these solution providers rely on to ship their software are now exposed under this law. Now, it's unlikely that would survive the courts and the rest, but before you start creating laws that make open source very, very difficult to ship in Europe, you should really think about these things. And it's something I really wanted to bring up with this audience because we're in Europe. I don't know if you know that. But it's really important to understand the unforeseen consequences, the implications of some of these acts. And the EU has done some remarkable work. And it's important that we're there for them so they can understand what the implications of their laws are. So for instance, another thing that's happening right now is there's some really exciting things going on in the codec space. So I want to say 13, 14 years ago, Google, we purchased a company called On Technologies, who were the developers of the VP8 and the VP9 codecs that you've seen in a lot of our tools like FFmpeg and the rest. And over the years, we've been working with hardware, software, mobile, proprietary, open source, free software providers to iterate on these codecs because codecs is something we all have to use all the time. It's on all of our devices. It's on every camera that we've got here in the place, commercial cameras, and the rest. And every provider has basically gotten on board with this new codec suite called AV1, right? It's the first time we've gotten everyone to agree that a single codec, a free codec, a non-patent encumbered codec is going to be the way forward. So, of course, the people who have a vested interest in the previous regimes of H.264 and H.265 are trying to lobby the European Union to either put the kibosh on using AV1 or make it possible for them to charge their patent suite against AV1 users. And we're not talking about a small amount of money. Yeah, maybe not a lot on an individual device, but for commercial devices, they've been talking in terms of hundreds or even thousands of euros, depending on the equipment. for licensing fees for these codecs. So they're vested in not seeing free and open codecs take hold. And so it's a battle we've been fighting for a very long time in the open source community through groups like John Baptiste's FFmpeg, all these people who have been working so hard in trying to provide free software for our friends in open source, and the whole world has benefited from it. So all I would say is keep an eye on what's going on with AB1 in Europe. It's really important that we get this right. Okay, here's the thing. It's easy for me to stand up here and say, hey, we should all look out for this stuff and all the rest. When someone like me stands up here and talks to folks, you should ask, well, that's great. That's nice that you're up on stage telling me what to do. What are you doing to make these changes happen, right? Not just working on codecs that clearly would advantage us, right? And that's true, right? So when we talk to people about making change in open source and in free software, I always caution them. It's like, listen, it's great to have these ideas on how open source can be better, can be different, can be the rest, but unless you're willing to throw in, unless you're willing to participate from your company, from your community, from your academia group, from your whatever, they're not going to actually listen to you, right? You can file as many bugs as you want until you start submitting patches, until you start becoming part of these communities. You don't have much say, and that's appropriate. And when lawmakers and policymakers say, well, we should make the open source community do this, and I'm like, who are you going to make do what? It's like, it's one thing to talk to a company that's in the open source space. We can talk about contracts and requirements and the rest, but when you start talking about passing laws that require open source to do something often counter to the open source definition, you should really ask yourself, well, what are you going to do, right? So along those lines, at Google, and this is the bragging part of the presentation, in case you're waiting for it. So our office at Google started in 2004, and our main goal was keeping the machinery of release oiled, right? Keeping it efficient, right? So it always starts there. It's like helping your engineers engage with the projects that matter to your company, to your academic group, or to yourself, right? And so as we were doing this, we were like, okay, how do we scale that program over the years? And so now we're at the point where I think in 2021, over 2,000 projects were released from Google alone. And that's just on to get on board. That's not counting on the other software repositories we submit to, whether it's, that was on GitHub. It's not counting our own software source repositories for Android and Chrome and the rest. We submitted patches to more than 9,500 projects on GitHub, the 2,000 that are ours, but then another 7,500 or so that belong to other people. We had more than 500,000 unique GitHub events. So GitHub has this API. We don't need to talk about that. But so pull requests, bug tracking, that sort of thing. So Googlers did that more than 500,000 times last year, and we were about 1% of GitHub's traffic. So we've managed to become a very well-oiled machine when it comes to submitting patches to the projects that matter to us and to our engineers. We also try to identify problems in free software and in open source early, and we try to fix them, whether this was the early open source network fabric switch support in the Linux kernel, or other aspects of improvements around the system software layer, all the way through the graphics layer that we really needed, yes, for Android and for Chrome OS, but where open source needed to go so that we could use it in our network switches, so we could use it in our edge caches, and the rest throughout our network and our production systems. So, but also, I hate to say it, I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes documentation isn't so great, right? So we've also identified programs and launched programs like the Season of Docs to create new documentarians, to have people improve the documentation for open source projects. And while it's great to be at this show because I don't recognize most of you, right? That was not always true. when I started at Google. And so we launched the Summer of Code to create new open source software developers who weren't just the same Unix graybeards that we'd see at every talk. Yeah, I'm familiar with it, my friend here. So, and you're wonderful, don't get me wrong, but we're getting older, right? We're going to start dying off. We need to have new people take primacy in these projects and rise to the fore. And so we've tried to create programs that help introduce people to open source through the Summer of Code. So we've had over 18,000 people take part in that program and come into the community of developers. But here's the thing. I'm not quite ready to say that open source developers don't have to do something, right? Because there's always something that we need to do better, right? And one of the things that a lot of people have been talking about is, of course, open source security, supply chain security, dependency security. And what it is people universally throughout the industry use open source software as the fundamental foundations of their offerings. Like I said, nothing wrong with proprietary software, but there's not a single piece of proprietary software that doesn't have within it open source software. And if you don't pay attention to those dependencies and they become insecure, your software becomes insecure too. So we're trying to think of ways that we can improve open source software security. We have teams working on patches, bugs. We have our open source fuzzing package that we released and program where they'll attack your software for you and try to create patches and try to create bug reports to help you improve your software. But another thing that we're doing, and it's a small thing, but it's kind of fundamental. So starting in 2012, so the Git maintainer, Junya Hamano, has worked for me since 2012. Anyways, so Sean Pierce, who is the project lead of JGit, and Junya, we were pretty worried about one aspect of Git security, which is people should be able to sign their commits. Right? Sounds simple, right? Well, the reality was we had to understand where they were signing it, who was signing it, and how. Right? And so we had to make really fundamental changes into the Git, the core C, Git, and JGit code itself to support this. And then it took another 5 or 7 years before GitHub would support it through libgit 2, which they were using at the time. I don't know what they're using right now. And so we added basically basic signing and then device signing, like with the Titan keys, to Git. So what I'm going to say to you is, a lot of you have been online for a very long time, and you've seen people say, do you want to use SMS or two-factor authentication with a device, right? This is that device. So this is the Titan security keys. We've got them at the booth. You just have to walk up and grab one. We don't want you to scan your badge if you don't want to. It's totally okay. Only take one, though, because we brought enough for everybody, but if everyone takes two, we want enough for everybody. So please go ahead and grab one of these and start thinking about how it can improve the security of your devices, of your internet life, and of your software that you might write. Because it's one thing to say, hey, y'all should be programming more securely. But it's like there's some fundamentals that we can help you with, right? And these aren't necessarily cheap. I mean, they're like 15 bucks, right? But if we can give one of these to every open source software developer so that they can sign their work, I think that could be a really great step forward, a small one, in making software more secure, more dependable, and more observable. So please go grab one of these at our booth here at the show. Oh yeah, so, and then we have one more slide, I think. No, I think that's it. Was that it? Yes, so I want to call back to that first slide that I used earlier. The open part of open source is what makes it remarkable, which gives it the longevity to be really the fundamentals of computer science, the computer industry, and where we program day to day, right? So don't forget how powerful that is. Don't forget the open source definition. It's really important to understand what free software, what open source is, and what it's not. And that's kind of it for me. And my colleague Jeff Bailey is going to be giving a speech at 1:30 up in the tech thing about, what was your talk about? compliance and productivity. So our whole lives is open source compliance. We love it. So go check it out if you're into such things. So thank you, and I'm going to give up the stage. That's my 20 minutes. 10, 9, I have to get off in 8 seconds. Thank you.
Our mission is to bring value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. Here, you will be able to find all of the latest videos on any of our over 2,000 open source projects, open source announcements, focused training like Learn Kubernetes with Google, new releases, events such as Google Open Source Live or BasilCon, and information about our outreach programs. Follow for this and so much more. Welcome to the Google Open Source YouTube channel.